At 10:45 on the morning of the 24th of November 1944, the sky above Tokyo looked calm. But far above the clouds, history was already in motion. Silver shapes appeared over the southern horizon. B-29 Superfortress bombers flying at 30,000 feet, higher than anything Japan had ever faced in combat. For the first time since the Doolittle raid more than 2 years earlier, American bombers had returned to the Japanese capital. This was not a daring one-time strike. This was something far more ominous. Below them, Japanese fighter pilots scrambled from airfields around Tokyo. They pushed their aircraft into steep climbs, engines screaming, fuel burning away with every meter gained. One by one, they reached the limits of their machines. At 22,000, 24,000 feet, the climb stopped. The air grew thin, controls softened, engines began to choke. Above them, the B-29 Superfortress formations continued on, steady and untouchable 6,000 to 8,000 feet out of reach. This moment was more than a failed interception. It was a revelation. American air power had finally reached the Japanese home islands, and conventional defense no longer worked. So the question Japan now faced was brutal and unavoidable. When the enemy flies where you cannot reach, what do you do next? The 24th of November 1944 Tokyo bombing raid was not intended to devastate the city. Its true purpose was far more strategic. The primary target that morning was the Nakajima aircraft factory at Musashino, one of Japan's most important centers for fighter production. Weather, however, turned the mission into a technical exercise rather than a destructive blow. Thick cloud cover obscured the target area, forcing most crews to rely on radar bombing rather than visual sighting. Of the 111 B-29 Superfortress bombers launched from Saipan, only 88 dropped their bombs. Fewer still struck the factory itself. On paper, the results were disappointing. But strategy is not measured only in bomb damage. The appearance of B-29 seconds over Tokyo sent an unmistakable message to Japanese planners. American bombers could now reach the home islands regularly, in strength, and at altitudes that rendered traditional interception almost meaningless. The Japanese air defense system, already strained by fuel shortages and declining production quality, was suddenly facing an opponent that operated beyond its effective reach. Japan's fighter force had been built around a different kind of war. Aircraft like the Ki-43 Hayabusa and the famous A-6M0 were masterpieces of maneuverability. Below 20,000 feet, they could outturn almost anything the Allies flew. Their pilots were trained for close-in dogfighting, where skill and reflex mattered most. But the B-29 did not fight that war. At 30,000 feet altitude, the rules changed completely. Engines designed for lower altitudes lost power. Control surfaces responded sluggishly. Climb rates collapsed. Even experienced pilots found themselves struggling simply to keep their aircraft airborne, let alone maneuver into firing position. Japan did possess aircraft theoretically capable of high-altitude interception. The Ki-44 Shoki, designed for rapid climb, represented a major departure from earlier Japanese fighter philosophy. It traded maneuverability for speed and climb performance. On paper, it could reach the altitude where B-29 seconds operated. In practice, climbing to those heights consumed enormous amounts of fuel. Once there, the thin air robbed the aircraft of speed and responsiveness. Pilots had minutes, sometimes less, before overheating engines, and fuel exhaustion forced them to disengage. Throttling back meant falling behind the bombers. Pushing harder risked mechanical failure or fire. This was the impossible dilemma facing Japan's defenders. American doctrine exploited that weakness ruthlessly. Fly high. Stay in formation. Use altitude and speed as defense. The bombers did not need to outfight Japanese fighters. They only needed to remain above them. And in those early months, it worked exactly as intended. By the end of 1944, the air war over Japan had entered a brutal phase of adaptation. Both sides understood the problem clearly. Only one side had the means to solve it. The B-29 Superfortress was unlike any bomber Japan had ever faced. Its pressurized crew compartments allowed sustained operations at extreme altitude. Its remote-controlled gun turrets, linked by an advanced fire control system, turned each formation into a moving fortress. 4 50-caliber machine guns in the tail, 8 in the upper turrets, and 2 in the lower forward position gave the bomber defensive firepower far beyond earlier designs. Yet the aircraft was far from flawless. Early operations were plagued by engine fires. The Wright R-3350 engines were powerful but temperamental, and crews feared mechanical failure as much as enemy action. In the first months, more B-29 seconds were lost to technical problems than to Japanese fighters. Still, altitude forgave many sins. For Japanese pilots, the challenge was relentless. The Ki-44 Shoki, intended as a high-altitude interceptor, could climb quickly but paid for that performance with limited endurance. At full power, its engine consumed fuel at an unsustainable rate. Pilots had perhaps 10 to 15 minutes at altitude before they were forced to disengage or risk not making it home. The Ki-84 Hayate, Japan's most advanced fighter, promised more. On paper, it rivaled American fighters at medium altitude. It was fast, heavily armed, and better protected than earlier designs. But even the Ki-84 struggled at 30,000 feet altitude. Controls became sluggish, engines overheated, guns jammed in the extreme cold. As manufacturing quality declined and fuel shortages worsened, theoretical performance meant little in combat. Every interception attempt became a race against physics. Pilots climbed hard, watching cylinder head temperatures creep upward while fuel gauges dropped alarmingly fast. If they throttled back, the B-29 Superfortress formations pulled away. If they pushed forward, engines failed. There was no winning balance. The results were devastating. Between November 1944 and January 1945, Japanese fighter units attempted hundreds of interceptions. Only a fraction resulted in actual firing opportunities. Even fewer produced kills. Aircraft were lost to engine failures at altitude, crashes during emergency landings, and sheer exhaustion as pilots pushed machines beyond their limits. American doctrine remained brutally simple. Fly higher than the enemy can fight. The bombers did not chase fighters. They did not break formation. They stayed at altitude and let gravity, thin air, and mechanical limits do the killing for them. Japanese commanders could see the numbers. The exchange rate was unsustainable. Conventional interception was failing. By early 1945, it was clear that if Japan wanted to stop the B-29 seconds, it would need to abandon conventional tactics altogether. And that realization would lead to one of the most desperate decisions in the history of aerial warfare. By early 1945, Japanese commanders no longer debated whether conventional interception worked. The numbers had already answered that question. Fighters could rarely reach the B-29 Superfortress formations in time. When they did, engines overheated, guns jammed, and fuel ran out before meaningful combat could begin. In January alone, Japanese units attempted more than 200 interceptions. Fewer than 40 resulted in actual firing opportunities. Only 3 B-29 seconds were confirmed destroyed. The exchange rate was catastrophic. Yet the bombers kept coming higher, faster, and in growing numbers. Cities burned. Aircraft factories struggled to replace losses. Japan's air defense system was bleeding pilots faster than it could train them. Something had to change. The first answer came not from doctrine, but from desperation. In August 1944, during a raid on the Yawata steelworks, a Japanese pilot deliberately rammed his fighter into a B-29. Both aircraft were destroyed. Word of the collision spread quickly through fighter units. What began as an isolated act soon evolved into a grim possibility. If Japanese fighters could not defeat the bombers with guns, perhaps they could destroy them with their own aircraft. In November 1944, orders formalized the idea. Fighter units defending the home islands were directed to form Shinten Seikutai ramming attacks, specialized 4-aircraft flights trained to deliberately collide with B-29 seconds. Aircraft were stripped of unnecessary weight. Ammunition loads were reduced. Fuel tanks were removed. The aircraft itself became the weapon. These were not officially suicide missions. Pilots were trained to strike the bomber's tail or wing at carefully calculated angles, hoping to disable the aircraft while giving themselves a chance to bail out or crash land. Survival was possible but never guaranteed. The training was precise and unforgiving. Pilots practiced approach angles, closure rates, and target selection. The preferred target was the tail section, where control surfaces were fragile. A successful strike could render the bomber uncontrollable. A mistake of a few degrees meant death. The psychological burden was immense. Every instinct in a fighter pilot's training warned against collision. To execute a ramming attack required absolute commitment. Hesitation meant failure. Some units achieved temporary success. Coordinated ramming attacks occasionally brought down multiple bombers in minutes. But these moments were rare and costly. Many pilots missed their targets. Others died without damaging the bomber at all.
Even successful attacks often cost Japan an experienced pilot and a fighter it could not afford to lose. Between late 1944 and mid-1945, roughly 100 ramming attempts were made. Fewer than 40 resulted in destroyed or critically damaged B-29 seconds. The mathematics remained unforgiving. Courage had not closed the altitude gap. It had only revealed how desperate the situation had become. From the American perspective, the changing Japanese tactics were noticed almost immediately. B-29 crews began reporting fighters that did not break away after firing. Instead, Japanese aircraft dove out of formation, built speed, and then pulled up sharply, aiming directly at bomber tails and wings. At first, intelligence officers assumed these were accidents caused by aggressive maneuvering.
But the pattern became impossible to ignore. These were deliberate, coordinated attacks. The psychological impact on bomber crews was real. Knowing that an enemy pilot might willingly collide with your aircraft created a different kind of fear. Yet fear did not alter the outcome. The B-29 Superfortress formations continued to fly higher and faster, exactly as doctrine dictated. Then, in early April 1945, the equation changed decisively. With the capture of Iwo Jima, American planners gained what they had always intended: a forward base for long-range fighter escort. The arrival of the P-51 Mustang escort transformed the air war almost overnight. The P-51 could operate comfortably at 30,000 feet altitude, climb faster than any Japanese fighter, and remain with the bombers all the way to their targets and back. Japanese ramming tactics required time. Fighters had to climb, position themselves relative to the bomber stream, and then dive to build attack speed. The P-51 seconds disrupted every step of that process. Japanese pilots were intercepted during the climb, or while maneuvering into position. Many were shot down before they ever saw a bomber. Even when ramming attacks succeeded, survival became nearly impossible. Escort fighters attacked immediately after impact, denying damaged Japanese pilots any chance to escape. By May 1945, the consequences were undeniable. Japanese fighter losses soared, while damage to B-29 formations declined sharply. Large raids, such as the Yokohama attack at the end of the month, demonstrated the new reality. Hundreds of bombers flew with heavy escorts. Japanese interceptors were destroyed before reaching effective range. Soon after, Japanese commanders made a painful decision. Fighter units would no longer contest most B-29 raids. The losses were too high. The results were too small. Remaining aircraft would be preserved for the expected invasion of the home islands. It was an admission of total defeat in the air. From that point on, the skies over Japan belonged entirely to the United States. By the summer of 1945, the outcome of the air war over Japan was no longer in doubt. The B-29 Superfortress flew where Japanese fighters could not fight effectively. That single fact shaped everything that followed. Ramming attacks, night interceptions, desperate climbs, all were attempts to compensate for a technological gap that could not be closed by bravery alone. Japanese pilots fought with extraordinary determination. Men who flew the Ki-44 Shoki and the Ki-84 Hayate pushed their aircraft beyond design limits, knowing the odds were against them. Some survived ramming attacks through skill and luck. Many did not. Their actions were not acts of fanaticism, but of duty under impossible circumstances. Yet courage could not defeat altitude. By mid-1945, Japan's cities burned almost unchecked. Industrial production collapsed. Fuel shortages grounded what remained of the fighter force. The combination of high-altitude bombing, overwhelming numbers, and the arrival of P-51 Mustang escort fighters from Iwo Jima made effective Japanese air defense impossible. When Japanese commanders chose to stop contesting most Tokyo bombing raids and other major strikes, it was not a failure of will, it was an acceptance of reality. The lesson of the B-29 campaign is both simple and unsettling. In modern war, technology and industrial capacity decide outcomes long before individual courage enters the equation. Skill matters, sacrifice matters, but without the ability to operate in the battle space at 30,000 feet altitude, in this case neither can change the result. After the war, survivors like Captain Makoto Ogawa spoke quietly about their experiences. They expressed no pride, only reflection. Others, like Captain Teruhiko Kobayashi, carried the lessons forward, teaching future pilots that courage without tactical understanding leads only to loss. The skies over Japan in 1945 offer a stark reminder. Wars are not won by heroism alone. They are won or lost by engineering, logistics, and the ability to adapt faster than the enemy. If this story made you pause, consider what lessons it still holds today. What happens when technology once again outruns defense? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you value careful, respectful exploration of military history, consider subscribing for the next chapter. The battle may be over, but the history is still being written.